Oh, we picked up an eighth person so far.
Oh,
Okay.
look at the trees. There's the tree
Yeah.
forest.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll get started and let people join in as we go. And we'll see if we have some questions also for next week. So today is Tu B'Shvat. So in honor of the trees, we had Renee do a program for us, and I have that on recording, and we'll get that up. But also, we wanted to talk just about some interesting research on trees and the medium they grow in, the soil and the atmosphere, and some relationship to fungus that I thought was kind of interesting. So we'll go over some current research and some questions, and we'll see what you think. I'm going to show a little short video clip to start us out with.
Don't know why I expect movement. It's trees.
What do you think you're doing?
The idea of talking trees has been capturing the human
A
imagination
little louder.
for generations.
Say something? My bark is worse than my bite.
Okay, so maybe they don't talk to us, but it turns out trees can talk to each other.
Trees are speaking to each other.
But that
Well,
does
can you
beg
make
the
it
question,
louder?
what do trees have to talk about? And can we learn to speak their language? Underneath the soil, a vast and interconnected network of life links the trees through their root systems. But they can't talk to each other without help. The whole process starts with hub trees, the oldest and tallest trees in the forest. Hub trees have greater access to sunlight, and through the process of photosynthesis, end up producing more sugar than they actually need. Underground, fungi need sugar to survive. Most of their bodies are made up of a mass of threads called mycelium. They grow within the root system of trees to absorb the excess sugar. In return, the mycelium provides the tree with the nutrients it needs from the soil. This symbiotic relationship is known as mycorrhiza, which stems from the Greek words for fungus and root. These tree-fungi relationships connect the trees in the forest together, forming an underground communication network to exchange water and nutrients, nurture their seedlings, and even send warning signals when under threat.
Oh, cool.
So, how many trees are really talking to each other? To get a better picture of these forest relationships, a team of researchers used DNA analysis to map a fungal network in a patch of Canadian forest. Remarkably, they found that one tree was connected to 47 other trees. Their models also showed that when hub trees were removed, it would cause more connections to be lost than if trees were simply removed randomly. Studying these kinds of underground exchanges will play a vital role in creating stronger, more resilient forests for the future. So even though we might not be able to talk to trees, at least we can still keep trying to understand their language. Who knows what they might say?
Is that it?
So could you see and hear that okay?
It was a little soft, yeah.
A little soft? Okay.
I didn't see the video. I only heard the audio.
Same with me. The video never happened. It just stayed on the initial tree.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
It was very pretty, but it wasn't a lot of motion.
Okay, well, hopefully I'll try one more video at the end and then I'll do the slides for now.
Okay.
So one of the video that I showed, some of the stuff was based on some research by Professor Suzanne Simard, and she's in Vancouver, British Columbia, and she comes from a line of a forestry family, and her grandfather was a forester, and she had intention of becoming a forester as well. One of the things, though, that gave her a little notion that she might want to vary her career path a little bit was her dog Jigs fell into the outhouse and fell down the hole and into the muck way down below. And so her and her grandfather had to dig a hole outside of the outhouse to try to rescue the dog. And as they were digging, she started digging through all kinds of things in the soil that she became very curious about. And she wondered, as she saw some of the trees surviving very well and some of the trees struggling a little bit, if some of the stuff that she saw in the soil, which turned out to be a lot of these thread-like root type of bodies called hypha and mycorrhizal filaments from fungus. And so one of the theories that she had was that not only were they communicating to this fungus, but they were maybe sending messages from tree to tree. And one of the trees that she saw that seemed to grow fairly well together was in British Columbia was paper birch and Douglas fir. So she tried this experiment thinking that they were exchanging some nutrients. One of the main nutrients being carbohydrates and sugars and carbon, was that she would shade. So she shaded the Douglas fir tree for a while, so it was lacking in that carbon. And she took the birch tree and injected some traceable carbon compounds into the birch tree to see if the fir tree that was depleted would gather some of this carbon from the paper birch tree, and found out that that was indeed what happened. And
Wow.
so she figured, since they weren't directly connected, that they might have been connected through something else. And the something else turned out to be fungal root hairs called hypha, or and the thing together is called mycelium, the whole group of them. And the term that they use to this symbiotic relationship is mycorrhizal. Myco meaning fungus, and rhiza meaning root. So the connection of the fungus and the root of the trees. So, and one of the things she noticed too was that we have this kind of idea of Darwinian evolution, that everything works this way. And the big trees are big trees because they're stronger and they're more aggressive. And she was feeling like that maybe this wasn't a good reading of Darwin or what was going on, that fitness, Darwin's concept of fitness meant, you know, how do these trees fit in the environment and how do they fit together? And she and others noticed that a lot of trees don't kind of grow big branches and try to knock the other ones out like you would think in competition, but actually share the sky space, but might also share some, you know, definitely seem to be sharing something underground. And she also found that connections, that carbon transfer of sugars happened even more so to seedlings of the same species that were probably came from the same tree. And then some relationships between other trees like Douglas fir and paper birch. But not all trees she found shared together. Some did, and all the species same species did share together. Some of the connections were so, and as the tree grows older and older, it seems to gather more connections. So the bigger the circle, the older the tree, and the darker the circle, the older the tree, and you can see the size difference too. These little yellow ones are saplings. and the lighter ones are younger trees. And you can kind of see that some of these trees, like this tree on the far right here, has just a ton of connections, and she figured that it was connected through these fungal hairs to at least 47 other trees in this immediate vicinity. So, and the way that it happens is kind of interesting. The tree roots here, you can see in the dark brown are the tree roots, and the light brown is the hypha or mycelium. Hypha is, I guess, singular. And you can see what it does. It actually invades. These are the root hairlets. So this is the root from the tree. And these are the little rootlets that come out from the root. And they gather nutrients and water from the soil. But sometimes they need some help. And one of the things that they seem to need help with is some of the minerals and some of the and water in some instances too, but a lot of the minerals, they don't have as much ability to gather that up as well as the fungus roots do, the mycelium do. So the mycelium are actually bringing over this nitrogen and phosphorus, and you see the carbon is coming out. The fungus, because it doesn't do photosynthesis and have green leaves, it doesn't produce its own carbon or sugars. So it relies on the tree, and that's the trade-off. The tree gives it the carbon and the sugars, and the fungus gives it the other nutrients. And there's quite a bit of nutrients. We'll look at some of the different ones. It's just not, the common ones that people talk about for plants are phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen. And those are very key things with plant growth, but they're not the only things.
Paul, I have a question for you. To really confirm that this carbon was transferring between the trees using this fungus, did you actually dig up some of the fungus in between the two trees so that, where the roots weren't, but just the fungus was, and then measure the carbon-14 in the fungus?
Yeah, so kind of to grind that, I'm not totally sure if she actually tested if there was a good way.
I mean, that would be the final confirmation of her idea, right?
Yeah.
That the carbon is being transmitted between the trees by way of the fungus.
Right.
Because you could always imagine that maybe some of it leaked out into the air and was picked up got into the other tree through the air rather than through the ground.
Yeah, so
or through
this
the
isn't
fungus.
carbon gas, it's sugars. So, but it could leach out. One of the things it does is that these trees, one of the ways they attract the fungus to come into the rootlets and the root hairs and the roots are to emit some of that sugar into the soil. And the fungus actually senses this emission of sugars and somewhat carbohydrates and fats too. And one of the researchers referred to it as cookies and cake for fungus. And that is that lots of sugar, a little bit of carbohydrate, and some fat that actually is exuded out of the trees and goes into the soil. And they think that that's what the fungus are sensing and going towards those rootlets to gather that stuff up. So, and they found out that a lot of the trees will shed at least 10 to 20% of their sugars into the soil. So not into their own leaves or into their own cells, but into the soil. And they think that the theory is that that's the purpose of it, to get this relationship and to get some of those minerals from the fungus. And when we think of fungus, when we walk out in the woods or something, we see the fruiting body of the fungus. So what's underneath the soil, unless you kind of like peel off the bark of a dead tree or kind of dig around in the soil, you might see some of this pale white, filament stuff. And those are the hypha or the mycelium. And all the fungus have those. And we see usually the ones that have fruiting bodies with the pores and the spore bodies, underneath these things. And those are these two types of fungi. The fungi that's most associated with plants, actually, their spores are in these little sacs, and all the action happens underneath in the soil. So it's a different type of fungi that's most predominantly related to that, and that's this Glomeromycota. And this is a close-up picture of it, and the spores are actually in here. So the spores get released into the soil, and the way that it travels is through water, liquid coming through there, and through insects burrowing through the soil, and that's how the spores go. And these are the filaments that will reach towards the rootlets of the trees. So here's a depiction of what that happens. And one of the things that happens with trees and with other plants too is that they have a nice root, and they have root hairs, and they are able to gather nutrients and water from the soil, but they need more than what they can gather in this little zone where they can reach out to. And that's one of the major things of the fungus, is it attaches to the roots and then goes out into the soil with much thinner filaments and can capture some of these nutrients and bring that back to the root of the tree or the other plant. So it
I
increases.
got one more question. These nutrients that are being depleted, is that mostly nitrates and phosphates?
Yeah, those are our major ones, but there's also other kinds of minerals, phosphorus, selenium, manganese, copper, and all kinds of things that you might find in your multivitamin. Is also
And they
something.
get depleted near the root relative to out in the area between the trees.
Right, yeah. And here's a little more, so this is the cross section of the rootlet, and these are how the mycelium, the hypha, invade into, sometimes they go right into the cells to exchange, and sometimes they go in between the cells to do their exchange. So this is just a little tree seedling. It could be a Douglas fir, and you can kind of see this is the tree root itself, but all this stuff out here is all the hypha or the mycelium that is connected to this tree root and bringing it nutrients back and forth. And so you can see it increases it quite a bit, up to 50–60% increase of what it could take if it didn't have this fungal association. And this is a picture of plants that they purposely inoculated the soil with the fungus. It's the same plant, and they're showing the different growth rate. So this has implications. You can kind of imagine that, people who are growing plants for a living, so our wheat and barley and corn and other crops, to vegetable crops and all that stuff, have this association just like the trees do. So it's an important area for people to study about how the benefits of these mycorrhizal associations might benefit the plant, their rigor of their plants, their ability to avoid drought stress, and uptake nutrients, which would be important for us as well. So these are some of the things that are benefiting. So the exploration of the soil we saw in that picture, it's just kind of increases the surface area kind of what happens. And also nutrient availability. So those smaller hypha from the fungus are actually better at uptaking the nutrients than the roots and the rootlets. So the availability of it, the way they can convert that to usable nitrogen and phosphorus, and the uptake of it. And then, they also store some of the reserves. So they might not give it to the tree right away, but it's there. And the other thing is the salt and toxic things in the soil. Fungus and bacteria are things that actually break down elements. So they're better at breaking things down than tree roots or other plant roots. So they're the masters at kind of doing that. And the fungus that I showed you with the fruiting bodies, those are the ones that kind of when I was first learning about fungus, the main thing that we learned about fungus was that it decomposes things. And without fungus in the forest, everything would be just sitting there and piling up year after year and century after century. And the fungus is what breaks it down. And that's true, that fungus, those two types of fungi that we showed you, that you see, are masters at decomposing along with some of the bacteria. But that also means that they can break stuff down and absorb the good stuff and break stuff down from the bad stuff and let that leach away, or at least break down into elements that aren't as toxic. One of the interesting things too that researchers point to is that the first land plants were probably these close to the ground growing plants similar to today's liverwort, and that the fungus appeared along with that. And they think that some of the success of plant life in general was, because of this association, that plants might not have made it onto land and thrived on land without the fungal association to begin with. So, we showed you the diagram. This is an actual magnified image underneath the ground. And this darker yellow greenish thing is the plant root. And these small filaments that look kind of like rice noodles are the mycelium or hypha that are attaching and surrounding this rootlet. But as is the case with lots of nature, there's a whole web and an interconnected thing. So I don't want to give people the impression that all you need is a little fungus and some soil and everything is fine. But there's actually like quite a bit more going on. And that is that the fungi and bacteria are both breaking down things close to these plant roots to help make it possible for them to digest and absorb that stuff. And also the nematodes, these little creatures in the soil and protozoa, are feeding on the bacteria and the fungi, and they're breaking stuff apart in those minerals and also in that little zone that we saw, and making that available to them. And in succession, arthropods, little creatures in the soil, will eat these nematodes and the protozoa, and bigger animals and birds will eat them. So there's a whole mixture of things that kind of work together to make things available in the soil and to make the soil what it is as far as the composition and the aeration in the soil, as well as the ability to hold water, and as well as the ability to make these minerals that are so important available to plants, trees and other plants. So again, this is the diagram, and in this zone here, so a lot of the feeding is taking place like right around here, and these nematodes and the protozoa are kind of breaking down the hypha and releasing some of the stuff in there. So it's not just the hypha, and one single relationship with the plant, but it's a complex of relationships that are making this stuff available in the medium of the soil. This is an actual magnification of bacteria in the hypha. And this is a magnification of one of the nematodes feeding underneath the soil. And like I was saying, it's not just nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but those are three of the main things. And but these are some of the other. These are 11 different nutrients and minerals, and there's actually about 40 some that we know of and that people can keep track of. But there's probably quite a bit more that are being exchanged that are just not as easy to study. But there's quite a few different types of minerals and things going on in the soil that are being broken down and made available through trees, through this whole system of gathering and eating and decomposition by bacteria, fungi, and also the little microorganisms in the soil. And this is a picture of how increased amount of fungus helps to support more and bigger plants. And this, you can see in this area, there's some compacted soil, very little bacteria, and no fungus. And so it's hard for plants to get going in that medium. And as you get more and more fungi and more bacteria, it encourages more and more microorganisms, the creatures, to come and eat, and to have that soil become more rich and mineral laden. And one of the things that the soil scientists like to talk about is the difference between soil and dirt. And they say, you know, that dirt is not full of all these kind of stuff. And you can see the soil here. What they're trying to depict is that the soil has more of a marbled consistency. So when the rain comes in, the soil holds a lot of water as well as a lot of nutrients, and there's a lot of action and mixing going on here, and there's a lot of nutrients available. Whereas the dirt, if you just have dirt and sandy or clay soil or something like that, it just holds some water and moves through and doesn't make that stuff available. So it's a hard medium for things to grow in, dirt or sand. So this is a depiction of not every plant needs as much fungal connections as other ones. And you can see all the way on the end here, old growth forest, the ratio of fungus to bacteria is 100 to 1 up to 1,000 to 1. So a lot of fungal connections. And as you go through to the smaller plants and to some of the grasses and vegetables, you do need the fungus and you need bacteria, and that will encourage the nematodes and the animals, the microorganisms, to come through and eat and make that available. But it's just not as heavy a need as some of these larger trees. So so you can get by with less, and you can build it up through, some people have done it through inoculation of fungus. So taking fungus and actually injecting it or depositing it in the soil. And that's what people do. Some people do that through composting as well. These are just some things that can disrupt it. And some of the disruption is kind of a natural back and forth, like with grasslands. The way that grasslands stay grasslands is through fire. So once the trees get big and the fungus starts to take over and things start to change, a fire might come and put it back to grasslands. Same things might happen in floods. The ultimate thing is a volcano coming and covering the landscape with rock, you know, or ash, and both. And that, in that way, it's kind of like brings the planet back to its original crust, where there wasn't fungus and bacteria started the decomposition, and the fungus eventually started coming into play and encouraging all those microorganisms also. So you can go all the way back to the beginning, even in some places today, if you have a big lava flow. One of the ways that some of the people have gotten into some of the talk about trees and fungus and is some popular books. And one of the most popular book, which was on the New York Times bestseller list, is this book from this man, Peter Wohlleben. I actually invited him, and his wife responded and said he was busy, but I said, how the book was inspiring and interesting, and so she said thank you, and that wished us good luck. So we did.
Does he live in Madison now?
Does he live in Madison?
Yeah, is he connected to the UW or something?
No, he's a forester, and he works in Germany, and he was born in Germany and is still in Germany. And he had some similar. Both him and Suzanne Simard, I think, are really kind of. I think making a lot of people more aware of what's happening with trees and soil. And there's a little controversy, and I can read some stuff about what that is about them. That it's about anthropomorphizing, what's happening with trees and plants. But I think some of their books and some of their talks have gotten people interested in what's going on in the soil. And it's kind of a nice thing because I think not only are people becoming aware of that, but I think that they're appreciating more and more that lots of interconnections between trees and the soil. And so there's lots of people working with farmers and foresters trying to incorporate some of these things to keep a healthier ecosystem, and to grow things better and taller and more rigorous without the use of chemicals. And he came to that through being a forester, and he was kind of frustrated with forestry and with the clear cutting, as well as Suzanne Simard, the woman we started with, and she has a bunch of very popular TED Talks, and he has this popular book. And so that's, how it's getting out to the general. One of the best ways to get out to the general public is to write some of the things. But some of the scientists feel like they are anthropomorphizing a bit and making trees seem like people. And I can read some more of that at the, as we go on, but I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things that he noticed about trees, which was he did notice the same thing about the fungal connections and the bacteria and the microorganisms in the soil, but he also wanted to talk about, this is a picture of him in the forest, and he used part of this forest. One of the ways he got the forest to become more of an old growth forest and not to be subject to clear cutting and more aggressive forestry is that he started burying people there. So he started a cemetery in the forest, and you can, be buried by an existing tree or dedicated tree. And so he felt like this would bring income. And then he also started doing tours and talks of the forest. So he turned it into more of an educational kind of retreat type of place, and a portion of it a cemetery. So this place that he was supposed to be logging, even if it was selectively logging, he turned more into more of a sanctuary type of place. And it's interesting too, in thinking about Tu B'Shvat and thinking about the connection of humans to trees. He has become fairly, I think he always was a little philosophical about it, but both him and Suzanne Simard talk a little bit about their emotional and spiritual connection to trees, as well as their scientific research, and feel like the two really go hand in hand and shouldn't be separated. And so that's an interesting thing that's happened with their study. And I think a bunch of people who really, cherish nature, that there is some kind of spiritual or religious component to their work and to their fascination and their energy and dedication to it. So one of the things he noticed was in places where trees do not have a lot of these underground connections, these are acacia trees on the savanna, and giraffes chomping away at some of the leaves. And some of these trees, all beings would like not to be decimated. And so they have various kinds of defenses. And one of the defenses that these trees have, even though it goes fairly slowly, they can kind of sense when some creature is eating them. And through the way they tear off and masticate the leaves, and also through sometimes their saliva or what their residue is on the leaves. So as these giraffes start eating the leaves, one of the things they noticed was that the giraffes, once they start eating from one tree, eventually they left the tree without finishing all the leaves, and also, in addition to that, walked further away from all the other trees, just kept going and going until they found a tree that was fairly far away. And the question this Peter Woolhaven had was, why do they do that? Kind of cute creatures. And the answer to that question was actually that, this is deer, was that the acacia trees were sending a signal through the air, so an aerosolized signal to the other trees that I'm in danger here and somebody's eating me. And the other trees got that signal and pump out some bitterness into their leaves, that in addition to these thorns that are supposed to keep other creatures away, but the giraffes have a way of nibbling around them. But they send out this aerosolized signal that say, hey, you should make your leaves bitter tasting as well to discourage this herbivory. And not only do acacia trees do it, but it seems like most trees have that kind of, these are deer closer to our home eating the leaves, and they also exude some kind of chemicals eventually when they realize that they're being chomped upon.
How
And
do
it
they
even
do
goes
that?
for,
Well,
yeah,
how
go ahead.
do they do that? How do they test that if the trees are using aerosol?
Yeah, so what they did was, I think that they actually measured something in the air, but they also found that the trees next to it were, even though they weren't connected through any underground connections, through fungal connections or something, we're still getting it. And we're still getting it. One of the tricks that the giraffes use, if the wind is coming from the north, they would head north to the other trees, because the trees to the south were getting the signals and the trees to the north were not. So they've kind of surmised this stuff from that, from measuring something in the air, and also from seeing where the reactions start to go. And you can measure some things. I don't know what the compound is in the leaves. I know that a lot of leaves around here develop these oxalate crystals to discourage animals from eating it, and it actually has some kind of abrasive nature on the animal's tongue. So that's one way of doing it. And then some of the bitterness can come through other chemicals in the trees. And the trees are kind of, it's interesting. They have more things going on than I know of, but I know that things are happening, that trees have hormones, and that trees have different things in their arsenal, and different ways of communicating. And one of the ways they tested out the hormonal type of things is, right now during the winter, trees are actually able to kind of keep track of how many days are under 40 degrees, because if a tree was just using moisture and sunlight and warmth to determine when to open its buds, it could get fooled. We could have some 60-degree days, in March or something. They could open up their buds, and then it could turn to 10 degrees below zero and everything freeze, and then the tree would have no flowers and no seeds and no fruits. And so trees have figured out a way to do that by counting days. So there's just lots of chemical things going on in trees to try to keep keep bark beetles out, to keep their leaves bad tasting, to grow thorns, to use hormones to keep track of things. So a lot more going on than we can notice, and even in some ways measure. There's some sometimes you're just making those assumptions by what the tree does, that those things are happening. Some of the hormones and some of the chemicals you can actually measure, but some of the ways they keep track of the days and the bud break was from observational studies.
Just as an aside, I was on the Serengeti, and there are acacia trees. Some of them are very far apart.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So they might not even, the aerosolized, communication might not even work for them.
Mm.
One of the interesting things too about deer browse is that it has the deer have a certain dentition, and it does break the twigs and damage the trees and the leaves in a certain type of way that trees can notice. So for instance, this tree was deer browsed, and this chomping at the end is the way the deer eats the tree. And if this branch had been out and it broke from some wind damage and ice damage, what would happen would be the tree would respond in a way to cover up the wound, and just that. But when it gets the deer browse, it actually sends this chemical signal to increase the bitterness and using this term knows, it gets a signal that there's something going on, that this is a signal to release some chemicals rather than to release the healing stuff at the end of the twig. So they kind of keep track of who's eating them, which is kind of interesting and elegant, that they can distinguish between a branch break, a leaf falling off in the winter, or an insect or a deer or some other herbivore eating them. And so wanted to end, is Marilyn still here? Marilyn, you are still here.
Yes.
So, we were doing the Tu B'Shvat, and I was figuring Marilyn would read us something about Tu B'Shvat. And we had this interesting quote, and I thought, I wonder if Marilyn will read that. So can you read it for us today?
Sure. I just have to move the pictures.
Yeah, can you move them down?
I have to move the pictures. I can't move you because I'll read it, but there are a few words that your picture's sitting on. And then I'll need you to help me read those words.
Okay, yeah, let me know.
I can contemplate a tree. I can accept it as a picture. I can feel it as a movement. I can assign it to a species and observe.
Observe it as an instance.
I can overcome its uniqueness and form
so rigorously
that I can recognize it only as an expression of law. I can dissolve it into a number, into a pure relation between numbers, and externalize it. Throughout all of this, the tree remains my object and has its time span, its kind and condition. But it can also happen, if will and grace are joined, that as I contemplate the tree, I am drawn into a relation and the tree ceases to be an it.
All right. Yeah, and that was what Rabbi Renee had for us, that she had excerpted for us to read, and I don't think we got to that last week, so I wanted to read it today. And I just thought it was kind of interesting because I think that we are connected, whether we think about it or not, or whether we like it or not. Trees give us oxygen, and the soil gives us plants. And if the soil really goes kaput, as our friend from Germany puts it, so are we. So we are connected, and I think in a way, just like, one of the criticisms about these trees talking to each other and these trees, taking care of their young and all this stuff is that they, some of the critics feel like that's sending us astray, that we're starting to think of it as an intentional thing, but it's a evolutionary thing, and it's a thing of instinct. But I do think in some ways, that we're all going, that we're all going by instinct, and we're all going to sleep when we're tired. We're all eating when we're hungry. We're all cooperating when we think it will work, and when we have this urge, to these people that gave birth to us, and these people that are brothers and sisters and our friends who are familiar to us, that we're sharing as well as sometimes competing. And, and that I think that's why people really do who really look at nature and are really, really trying to understand it wind up as philosophers, because it's almost impossible not to, if you really think about it, because we aren't really separate beings, just like people think of, ant colonies, and somehow, all this stuff works together, and people wind up building the anthill and finding the food and sharing the food when they need to, and sometimes defending the nest. It doesn't seem like it seems like we are all connected in that way, even, and we all have cells, so ultimately we did all come from the same thing. We don't exist or appear out of nowhere. We came from some similar things.
Okay, I've got a couple of comment questions on this. One of the things I see out of this is that in the future, as more is known about how this whole network works, farmers should be able to increase their yields by not just, normally they think you plow up the ground, you put on fertilizer, manure, nitrates and phosphates, and maybe a few other trace things. But really, if you wanted to be efficient, you would sample your soil, find out what it does and doesn't have, and then as the farmer's plow, he's going to infuse it with some combination of micronutrients, but also fungus and bacteria mixed together, plow them into the soil to supplement what the soil is lacking to grow your crops and your corn or your, soybeans or whatever.
Yeah.
So you would be, just like you showed that picture of the two plants growing side by side. One of them is in the soil and the other was just in the dirt, and how one of them was growing so much better than the other. The farmers should be able to utilize that ability to greatly or significantly increase their production of crop.
Yeah.
And then, so that might be the future of farming. Then the other thing is, to get back to dog-eat-dog competition, which I was brought to believe that these plants are competing for sunlight and for, and they're shading each other. You have the idea of succession. If the ground is cleared, the first trees to move in are these fast-growing trees like aspen and birch, and pretty soon other trees like hickories and oaks, that they outgrow them and shade them. And eventually, in this part of the country, you end up with maple. And the maples are bigger, taller, and their leaves give more shade, and they outshade the others. So the final climax forest, if the whole system is allowed to go to completion, becomes a climax maple forest. And somewhere, we did a trip somewhere south of Pittsburgh, I think, there is a climax maple forest. Do you remember can you think of where I'm talking about? And when you go there, it was like a hot summer day, humid heat day. We got to this maple forest, and when you walk into the maple forest, it's just like going into an air-conditioned building. Under the leaves, under the shade of those maple trees, it was cool to the point of, since it was hot and we were perspiring, it was almost like being in an air-conditioned building, and you start to get a little bit chilly because it's very hot and humid outside that forest. You get into the shade of the forest and it is cold. Yeah. And the other thing is that there's only maple trees. Everything else has been shaded by the maple trees to the point no other trees were growing in there. And the only other plants that could grow is like early in the spring, before the maple leaves get a chance to take away all the sunlight. You had these little plants that flower, and pretty little plants that bloom in the early March and April. And then pretty soon, by June or so, they're dying off, shriveling up, because those maple trees are gathering all the sunlight, and hardly anything gets to the floor of the maple forest. And when you go in, it's not only cool, it's also pretty dark. I mean, the bright sunny day, no clouds, you get into that maple forest and it's dim, because not much light is getting through those maple trees.
And there's examples of that in Madison, and one of the things that you'll all be familiar with is Maple Bluff. And Maple Bluff is Maple Bluff. If you look at a map of Madison, Lake Mendota is 5.5 miles long at its widest part. And on the edge of that 5.5 miles, if you go from west to east, is Maple Bluff, on a bluff in the corner of the lake, at the very edge, the eastern edge of the lake. And one of the things that has happened historically is that winds, the prevailing winds come from west to east. And we have, for thousands and thousands of years before the 1800s, when farmers came here, the predominant type was oak savanna of the landscape. We had lots of wetlands, we had oak savanna, we had some prairies, and a little bit of forest here and there. But Maple Bluff became Maple Bluff because the winds couldn't whip around both edges of the lake and burn that part up on the bluff. And so Maple Bluff has been maple, forest for thousands and thousands of years, whereas the other parts of Madison has not been. And that was because of natural fire suppression. Now we have human fire suppression. And one of the things that I see in one of my favorite spots at the Arboretum, and Estelle can probably relate to this too, is that there had been an oak forest. There is an oak forest. Galistelle Woods is a remnant of an oak forest or oak savanna. But if you walk through there and you know what maple saplings look like, there's tens of thousands of maple saplings just waiting to do what Jim said, to transition to what the climax is in our fairly moist area. We're at the very edge of the prairie system, and that could become a maple forest depending on how they choose to manage it.
The Arboretum could turn into so the Arboretum was a farm at one time and all the trees were cut down. So it hasn't had time. Say, gee, how come it's not a maple forest now? Well, it hadn't had time.
Yeah.
But and this is a slow process, but on human scale, but on nature scale, this is almost like an inevitable process. The maples are going to take over because they shade their competition. So it's still kind of a dog eat dog world in the tree community.
Yeah, and prolific. Go ahead, Marilyn.
I was going to recommend a book that our book club read a couple years ago, and I don't remember how I heard about it to recommend it, but it's called Lab Girl, and it's written by Hope Jahren, Jahren. And it's a memoir. She's received scientific awards. She's a geobiologist and a geochemist. And it was the first time that I was exposed to the fact that trees communicated with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting. Her life is very interesting.
Yeah.
Her research is very interesting. So I would recommend it if you're interested. And The Hidden Life of Trees by the Peter, I don't know how to say his name.
I think it's Volhaven.
Okay, that sounds interesting too. Yeah. But I would just add Lab Girl as if you're interested.
I requested that book from the library. I think there was 47 holds on it.
Well, Marilyn,
and I heard
LA.
I heard somebody talking. I don't know if it was to her, but it was an interview on the radio about that book.
I think she may have also been interviewed on a TV program. I'm not 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have the title correct? LAB, girl as in laboratory?
Yep.
Yes, LAB.
Not LAP, as in lap dance.
No. LAB is in biology.
Okay, LAB girl.
And she did her undergrad at Minnesota because she's from Minnesota. And then I've got an article here, but then she went to Berkeley at the University of California. She's been at the Georgia Institute of Technology, John Hopkins, and I think now she was in Hawaii, and I think now she is in Oslo, Sweden. I'm not 100%, but
do you mean Norway?
Yes, Norway or Sweden.
Okay, go ahead, Lorna.
I have several comments. When the eruption in Washington, within a year, as soon as the lava cooled, they had plants growing in it.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have a cemetery, I think just south of Madison.
Yep.
That's a natural burial.
Yeah, Nature Path Sanctuary.
Yeah. And
I live 2 miles away from that. Yeah.
I have a little lime tree growing in a pot. Should I give it multivitamins or go out and get some soil and stick it in with that little tree?
I don't know, you know, you could probably, I don't know, you know, as far as pot-bound plants, if the fungus and bacteria would work, I would suppose it would, because I think they grew that plant that they used as the example in one. So you could, you know, they call it inoculant. And I don't
Yeah.
know, and certain plants do prefer certain fungus and bacteria. So you might want to look it up and see.